a sort of circuitous path in that I always loved stories, but I never really saw myself as an author because I never saw people who looked like me on shelves. And so growing up through high school, going into college, I thought, people like me don't write books, but I could edit books because I love stories. And so I really threw myself into this sort of publishing path. I wanted to be an editor. I interned in all these publishing places. And it took me a long time to sort of find the courage to realize, oh, I could edit books, but I could also write them myself. And the stories that I have are things that other people can relate to and are sort of valuable. And a lot of Milagro's story of sort of going onto a college campus is really sort of my process of realizing the things that people have said to me or the things that I've encountered don't matter as much as myself, doing the work, believing in myself, and a little bit of luck for sure.
Well, what I think is so exciting about this is, one, like you said, the story that you wrote is so relatable, but what a difference it's going to make for other kids who are reading it and seeing, oh, here's somebody who looks like me and is an author. I can do that too. It's like helping change the whole landscape.
I hope so. I hope so. That would be really amazing. And when I teach creative writing, so when I work with my students, I'm always I tell them they are just as capable of writing a book as I am. And it's it's a mix of hard work. It's a good idea, but it's also sort of like you just got to keep writing words on the page.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Lulu Milagro's Search for Clarity. And you said a lot of it was out of your own experiences that you worked in college admissions, especially working with first generation students. So what is it about that first generation college experience that you really wanted to come out in the book?
I really wanted to sort of celebrate how much courage it takes to be the first person in your family to do something. And whether you have your family's support or, you're sort of trying to get them to convince them that this is a good idea, like the initiative that it takes for a kid to be interested in college, to seek out a guidance counselor, to fill out the application, especially if maybe you don't have a mom that can edit your essays, for example. My parents, English is their second language. They weren't really giving me feedback on my application questions. And when I became an admissions officer, I met so many more of those students and I realized just how common of an experience it was. And it's not like the journey is alone in that they don't have community support all the time, but oftentimes the support can come with a little asterisk like, oh, you can go to college, but how about you stay close to home? Or you can go to college, but how come why don't you become a doctor? And so sort of untangling that and realizing what is my dream, what is my mom's dream, and where is there room for both of us to sort of coexist. Because I also wanted to honor how much work it takes to raise a kid who's able to go to college if that's something they want. That takes, you are also as a parent, requires a lot of sacrifice. And I didn't ever want it to feel like the sacrifice was in some way like oppressive in any way. Like, I think like parents do a lot of really hard work and that's also worth celebrating.
Yeah, I love that. And also, like I said, a lot of your book is about dealing with family expectations, and you said it comes out of your own experiences, being having parents who are immigrants and the people that you've worked with in college. So how do your characters deal with that?
I think, a lot of Lulu is me as a high school student and sort of this idea that if I didn't do it the best, if I didn't try my hardest, it wasn't worth doing at all. And that sort of shuts you off from romantic opportunities, friendship opportunities, because you're sort of so thinking only, how can I be number one? And it's really lonely there. And it cuts her off from her family. So that was definitely, I wanted to show that success does not have to be a competition. It doesn't have to be alone. And with Milagro, the expectations for her were really low. And I wanted to show that it's really possible to exceed expectations. And in some ways, the only way to exceed those expectations is to stop listening to them. And there's sort of a lot of emphasis that the people around her put on the way she dresses, or the fact that she likes boys and is, you know, very interested in her boyfriend Pablo, as this idea that you can only fit in one single category, and that sort of makes it easier to understand her. But all three of the sisters are really sort of like all of us cannot be confined to a single category or a single description. We're not just the smart sister or the pretty sister or the good sister. And Glada, you know, she doesn't have her own voice, but she's sort of crumbling under the expectations of what it means to be good. And she's sort of like a little phoenix in the background, sort of figuring out how to rise out of that.
You got a comment. There's someone saying that success shouldn't be a competition. And yet that's often how it is, even in families and even when they love each other. Like you said, a lot of times we tend to put siblings into categories, like you said, the smart one, the pretty one, whoever. One of the things that I think is so clever about your book is because the characters, they're in the same family. So in a lot of ways they face a lot of the same pressures or expectations, and yet they have such distinct personalities. The way they deal with those pressures is so different that it's kind of, to me, it was like a way of showing, look, there's no one immigrant child experience. There's no one first generation college experience that, even though they might face similar situations, the way they deal with it is different. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, the other thing I didn't want it to feel like college was the Band-Aid, like it fixes everything. You go to school and life is perfect. And a lot of that comes after I worked admissions. Most recently, I was working as a college advisor. So I worked with kids who were picking their major, picking their classes, and sometimes it doesn't go well and they feel like such a failure. And to me, it's like, this is an opportunity to sort of recenter yourself. What are your goals? Is this where you want to be right now? And I wanted to show, like, school, Milagro had written off college, but it might actually be an opportunity for her. Glada, it had been all she'd been told, and actually things will be okay if it's something she comes to later, or even something she comes to maybe not at all. And their mom is pretty successful without a college degree, as is their aunt. And I sort of wanted to show these are women who are able to sort of command themselves in a room and take care of their family. And they've all sort of found this path to stability, and it doesn't have to be so prescriptive.
I love that, which is something that a message that a lot of kids probably are not getting, you know, because we do kind of present like there's one path to success and that's it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the skills that you can get your freshman year of college, you can also sort of get at, you know, spending a year. Some people took a gap year, but even a year working or a year trying out one or two community college classes before you dive in full time. I wish that there were more sort of like a longer runway of sort for students. I think it would really allow students a little bit more time to find their footing before diving in. But that's sort of higher ed stuff.
No, I mean, not to get too off topic, but I know so many people that I went to undergraduate with that went back and got a second degree because they really didn't know what they wanted the first time around. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And I used to tell my students, like, if you can't answer why do I want to be here, besides saying like my mom says so or my dad says so, like I don't like why are we here, you know?
Right. And can we talk a little bit more about imposter syndrome, which I know you have mentioned in some of your interviews, that in terms of your characters who, like you said, they have trouble believing that they can be successful and they can succeed on their own terms, but also for being a writer. I mean, you touched on this kind of at the beginning, talking about how there's so few writers of color out there. What do you think? How does having more diversity in literature kind of help deal with that kind of pressure? And what advice would you have to somebody going through this in terms of your students or somebody else maybe who wants to be a writer but just doesn't have the courage to take that step like you did?
Yeah, I think one is sort of so I didn't start writing until after college. I was sort of and I'd waited a
Mm-hmm.
long time before I even started working on this book because I had this idea that it had like it took me a long time, as I mentioned, to find the courage, but then also once I started writing the book, it took me like 6 months to write the last 20 pages just because I was like, oh no, when I finish this book, I'm gonna have to do something with it. And I
Oh,
was just so
putting it off.
afraid of that. I was putting it off, and you know, I was really lucky in that the manuscript, like the agent selling the book, it all went really quickly. And sometimes I wonder if that's also because I held on to it for so long and I was waiting for it to be perfect. And I think a lot about the years that I spent sort of working on this instead of like trying to do as much as possible. And I think a lot of it is sort of finding a way to shut out external and internal voices and just kind of committing your stories to writing. It's also finding a group of friends or writing peers who can force you to send your writing to them, and so they can say, no, this is good, you need to do something with
Mm-hmm.
it. I also think it's recognizing the traits in yourself, in your story, that you are uncompromising about. And like, these things will never change about my story, no matter what feedback I get, because it's important to me. And that's sort of with Milagro and Lulu, they both undergo a really big journey, but it doesn't require them to change anything about the things they love, the way that they dress, the way they
Mm-hmm.
carry themselves in the world. I think that holding on to your core values, building a community around you, even if it's not you know uh, as official as like a grad school seminar or something, and then having people who will hold you to getting your stuff out there is probably like the best way, for me was the best way to kind of conquer that imposter syndrome.
Ah, that's wonderful. And I love that you're talking about holding like knowing for yourself what your core values are, because I imagine that must be really hard when you start to get feedback. There's that temptation or that question of what's okay for me to change and what isn't okay. So that's a great idea to make sure you have that well established before you start getting that feedback from people. And it's
Yeah.
also kind of, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna, yeah, I did an MFA program, which is I think a great option for me. It was free, so that was why I did it. But a lot of people in my program didn't read YA, and so the feedback that they were giving me, like, add more history of Peru, explain why the mom immigrated, and I was like, well, that would be a different book.
Right.
It wouldn't be YA, and like I think a lot about if I had not been certain about what the direction I wanted to go in, if I had listened to them, I could have very easily lost track of what I was working on.
Right. And also it kind of leads back to talking about YA, but also you say you really love writing for teens, partly because in a way we were talking about core values. This is kind of when they're establishing what their core values are. They're starting to kind of come out into the world and look at a little more critically and figure out who they are. Can you talk more about why you decided to do YA?
I think there's something so special about the first time that you sort of stand up for what you believe in, whether that's standing up to your parents or your school community or your religion, or if you write dystopian, like a dictatorship regime. But I
Right.
think like that process of figuring out, these structures that are set up around me are not serving me. How will I deal with this? That journey
Mhm.
feels so special and really sets the road for how they develop as young adults. And I think
Right.
the hard thing is teens are so much more active and more, I feel, politically active and sort of savvy and well connected than when I was a teen. And so I'm always thinking
Mhm.
when I'm writing my books, like how can I make my characters as aware and well read sort of as teens today are. And I really see that
Mm.
in my students as well.
Right. Well, I imagine working with students probably helps you stay in touch with that a little more than some of the rest of us are who maybe aren't as connected with, that age group.
Yeah, I think, but also they are sort of like trying out, they're sort of trying to bridge out of YA. So I do teach a YA class, and that is really fun. We're all sort of celebrating and writing YA. But then my other class, they're sort of, I want to do mystery books, I want to do high literary. And so it's really fun to get an eclectic mix.
Yeah. Well, so can you tell us what you're working on now? I mean, this book hasn't been out for very long, so I don't even know how far you are into another project. Have you started thinking in that direction though?
Yeah, in the pandemic, I got really into quilting, and I became really obsessed with this idea of art and tradition and sort of art, making art for art's sake outside of a museum, and sort of how art can exist and people are artists without the recognition. Like Western PA has this incredible history of like women textile artists. And so this next book that I'm working on, I guess this is a long way of saying, is about a girl who wants to work in museums and has this whole plan ahead of her, and slowly realizes she's been too afraid to call herself an artist. And that, it's really similar to my journey, and sort of thinking like, how can she realize that she is an artist with or without sort of these accolades and contests and things that she sees around her.
I love that. And for those that haven't checked out her website, you should go, because there's a whole section about quilting and some of the work she's done. It's really cool to look at. And just to wrap up, thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to read your next book. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a copy of your book in time, but I did find a sample of it. It actually had a really nice chunk that you can read, that you can find online. I can't remember. You have the link on your website to be able to read that. So you get to read it, and just the characters come through so clearly, and it's just a really great story. So everybody should go check it out.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks everybody that joined us.